Titanic disappeared beneath the surface of the Atlantic at 2:20 a.m. She was alone, isolated. She was calling for help and no one could reach her. Few could even hear her. Most of the world was asleep at the time and would only hear of her end the following morning. That is the Titanic story, as we feel it went. 2:20 a.m., the almost iconic time that we understand Titanic's stern disappeared beneath the waves, is 2:20 a.m. ship's time. That would have been about 12:18 a.m. New York time. For those of us out here on the West Coast, Titanic hit the iceberg at 6:38 p.m., and the recently introduced wireless telegraph even allowed a select few on land with strong enough equipment to hear Titanic's calls for help as they were being sent. Titanic was much more connected to the world around her during her sinking than we might expect for an event in 1912. You could even argue that a select few on land may have known the ship was sinking before some on board Titanic knew the ship was sinking. And although this is not at all how we may have imagined the sinking to go, and most of her survivors would probably agree with us that it was a very isolated event, that is not how Harold Bride would have felt. Last episode of Witness Titanic, we met Mr. Bride. We boarded Titanic with him. We met his chief operator, John Phillips, who helped save 712 lives when he decided to break the rules of the Marconi company and fix his own apparatus. We heard about the ice warning from the Californian that Bride received, and we slept through the collision for the first time on this podcast. And Captain Smith stopped by the wireless room and told Phillips and Bride to let nearby ships know Titanic was in distress. Today on Witness Titanic, we continue with our questioning of Mr. Bride and hope, as always, to witness Titanic ourselves. Before we do a few little housekeeping notes here, first of all, I want to thank Ricardo Rosi for joining us in a little surprise cameo last week. I was recording the Marconi testimony for that little bit, and I thought, well, Ricardo's Italian and he's got such a great accent. So I sent him the text and he sent it back to me real quick. He did a great job. So thank you, Ricardo, for the unexpected appearance in the last episode. I said light holler a bunch again in that episode. As people should know, I say light toller wrong. I say light holler for some reason. It's an old childhood habit that I need to kick, and it's going to take me a while. So do forgive me. But in this episode, I will do my best to say lightoller. That was pretty good. Also, a little apology out to everybody. The last episode, the Harold Bride episode, I recorded it weeks ago, and I finally got it up this past week. So there was a bit of a gap between Ricardo's episode and Harold's episode. You know, life happened. A lot of things went down over here. One of which is I got a puppy. I already have a dog, but we got a puppy. And so you may hear some noises in the background because she's asleep over there, and I'm praying she stays asleep for the rest of this recording, but she will probably wake up and start running into stuff. So if you hear little noises, it's not in your house, it is in mine. And as always, I must thank my patrons, especially because this last episode took so long to go up. I, of course, let them know ahead of time that I don't think I'm going to get the episode up in time. I'm so sorry. You guys are so supportive. And everybody was just so kind about, you know, life getting in the way and just being kind. I'd love everybody who's on our Patreon and all the people who comment on the videos. There just seems to be a nice energy out there for the Witness Titanic community, and I'm very happy about that. That's why I end each episode with "Be kind to each other, Titanic community," because we need a little kindness in the world, don't we? All right, let's get into the episode. To get a fuller picture of Bride's experiences, we are actually going to expand our source material a little bit for this episode. Most of what you will hear today like last episode, is going to be from the U.S. Inquiry, of course, but there is one other source that I would like to draw from. Not the New York Times article, which we will get to at the end of this episode. I promise. We have a lot of really interesting things to talk about with that article. But the material we're going to expand to is actually a letter that Harold Bride wrote to his employers at the Marconi Company to tell them the full story of what happened on Titanic. I assume, just to make sure his company knew the rumors you're hearing aren't true. This is exactly what happened in writing from me. Don't fire me, that kind of thing. Like I would want my employer to know. So he wrote a letter. Now, usually we would be a little wary of letters because you never know. Did he actually write them? Who knows where these things come from over a century? But we can be pretty confident about this because he submitted this letter himself to the U.S. Inquiry to serve as a bit of additional testimony. So it is through the U.S. Inquiry and this letter written by the witness that we rejoin Bride and Phillips in the wireless room in the early hours of April 15th. What time it is exactly is hard to say for now. So far tonight, they have been sending distress calls to any ships near enough to hear them. 3 nearby ships have been reached: the Frankfurt, the Carpathia, and the Olympic, Titanic's sister ship. Carpathia is the only ship near enough to make an attempt at a rescue and is full steam ahead in their direction, but as we know, will not reach Titanic in time. So things are starting to look bleak, even to these 2 young men who are in a windowless room on the boat deck, fully isolated from the chaos going on all around them. Isolated from the chaos, but also they're the only 2 people on board connected to the entire world. What a wild place for these 2 young men to be. Mr. Bride, you remained with Mr. Phillips at the apparatus for how long?
All the time.
Did you continue to send messages, or Mr. Phillips, up to the time you left the cabin?
When we had finished with the Frankfurt and we had thoroughly informed the Carpathia of our position, Mr. Phillips again went out to look and see how things were going outside. I tried to establish a communication with the Baltic, and it was not very satisfactory, and I judged myself from the strength of her signals that she was too far away to do any good, and it was not worth taking any trouble. And I told her we were sinking fast, and there was no hope of saving the ship.
Did Mr. Phillips return from the deck?
Yes, sir.
What did he say to you then?
He told us he thought it was time we put on our life belts. Mr. Phillips told me that things looked very queer outside. Beyond that, I knew nothing.
How did you interpret the word queer?
The sooner we were out of it, the better.
Now, Bride just said that things looked very queer outside. Beyond that, I knew nothing. Well, let's turn for the first time to this letter to the Marconi Company to hear that there is a bit more urgency to this moment.
Mr. Phillips told me the forward well deck was underwater, and we got our life belts out and tied on each other after putting on additional clothing.
So water has flooded the forward well deck. This essentially means that the entire bow is underwater or right at the surface. That's a pretty big milestone in the sinking from a visual standpoint. To see that the bow of the ship is underwater is a little terrifying. But what is so great about Phillips seeing this and telling Bride about it and Bride remembering it and putting it in this letter is it gives us a rare opportunity to track the timing of the sinking. Not everybody says, I looked at my watch at 12:45 and at that moment, Lifeboat 7 was launched. If only it were that easy. Usually everything is within a range of 10 minutes, give or take. But here, we know that John Phillips went outside, Bride exchanged messages with the Baltic. The Baltic's operator recorded these messages as coming in at 1:47 a.m. Titanic time. Then Phillips comes back in and says the forward well deck is flooded. So we can now say with relative certainty that at some point leading up to 1:47 a.m., the well deck became flooded. This seems very small, but connect enough of those dots throughout the sinking, throughout all these different testimonies that you read, and you start to bring Titanic into focus. An event that has no photos, no videos, and we still have the ability to recreate it. And it's observations like these tied to times that give us that opportunity. This also gives us a much needed update on how long Bride and Phillips have to reach another rescue ship and escape Titanic in a lifeboat. They have just 33 minutes. Surely this flooded well deck will be the sign for the wireless boys to abandon their post. How did you expect to leave the ship?
We had to wait until the captain told us first. He came along in a very short period afterwards and told us we had better look out for ourselves.
How long was that before the ship disappeared?
I should say it was just about a quarter of an hour.
In his letter to the Marconi Company, Bride even gives the captain's direct quote as he remembered it.
You can do nothing more. Look out for yourselves.
So now, with just 15 minutes left, and the permission of the captain, surely the boys abandon their post.
No, sir, because we did not leave the cabin immediately when the captain told us to. Phillips gave another call of CQD, I believe, and had an answer to it.
Was that last CQD all you said or all he said?
That was the last, because we were of the opinion at the end that we were not getting a spark, owing to the poor supply of power.
And so Bride and Phillips are finally ready to abandon their post, but only because they feel their messages aren't even getting out. What they don't realize is their messages are being heard, but Titanic's power is dwindling. Nearby ships can tell it's dwindling based purely on the strength of her signal. The sounds of her CQDs and SOSs are getting quieter and quieter. In fact, by this point in the sinking, Titanic's signal had grown so weak that anyone on land who had been hearing her messages now can only hear the other ships talking to Titanic. Slowly throughout the night, less and less operators will hear Titanic's calls as her voice gets weaker and weaker. We now jump back into Bride's letter to hear about the dramatic conclusion of their time in the wireless room.
Leaving Mr. Phillips operating, I went to our sleeping cabin and got all our money together, returning to find a fireman or coal trimmer gently relieving Mr. Phillips of his life belt. There immediately followed a general scrimmage with the three of us. I regret to say that we left too hurriedly to take the man in question with us, and without a doubt, he sank with the ship in the Marconi cabin as we left him. Leaving the cabin, we climbed on top of the house comprising the officers' quarters and our own, and here I saw the last of Mr. Phillips, for he disappeared, walking aft.
What a wild story. As water slowly advanced up the boat deck to the wireless room, Bride and Phillips had to physically subdue a member of the crew attempting to steal Phillips's life jacket off his own back. And they left him, presumably unconscious, to drown in the wireless room. While this story does not appear under oath in the U.S. testimony, which would usually be a red flag, the UK inquiry does ask him about it, and he does confirm it. He even explains in a little bit more detail how they subdued the man. Apparently, Bride held him, and Phillips hit him. Unreal. What is the most important thing about this story, though, is that this kind of makes it the only credible source that I know of an actual fight happening on board Titanic as she sinks. We hear all the time from newspaper articles mostly about how people were fighting each other and fighting for spots in the boats, and men were fighting with women, and generally these are not backed up by anything. This story, though, we actually have fists being thrown in the name of self-preservation. The drama that often gets created actually existed, and that's why stories like this can be so frustrating. When you out there, Titanic people out there, you know how much historic slop floats around the internet about Titanic, coal fires and switch theories and third class trapped like rats, all that. There are dramatic stories like this If you do just the most surface level of research, this moment would be an incredible one to recreate in a Hollywood film. But sure, let's keep trotting out Bruce Ismay like the punching bag he is and show him pressuring the captain to go faster. There is drama if you know where to look. Okay, quick break from Harold Bride to talk a bit about the fighting on board Titanic. Just a little aside. I got a comment on episode 28 of the podcast, on the Charles Dahl episode, that I absolutely must share with you. In that episode, I made a big deal about one of the articles claiming that men were fighting with women to get into the boats and how patently false that is, thus proving whoever said it clearly was not on board Titanic. But one of my listeners, Chris VK2ZW, pointed out that to them, this could just mean that men were fighting with women to get the women to go into the boats because they would not go. 100%. Chris, that is a fantastic comment, a great thought. That could very well be what that actually means. It could mean either way. Unfortunately, we won't know it. It could mean both, but your explanation is much more reasonable than mine. So I just wanted to bring that up because if that is what they intended, then I owe Charles Dahl and that newspaper editor an apology. All right, back to Harold Bride. So Bride and Phillips abandoned the wireless room finally, and they part ways after sending the most famous dots and dashes of all time. Now, when exactly this happened, when they finally gave up sending distress calls, can be debated a little bit. According to the other ships in the Atlantic, messages from Titanic were heard as late as 2 a.m. Titanic time and may have been heard as late as 2:12 a.m., 8 minutes before the ship disappears forever. And who knows, they may have transmitted even longer, but if they weren't getting a spark, messages wouldn't have been heard anywhere else. So who knows if they stayed later. In any case, this is heroism of the highest degree. This is not the engineers staying down in the engine room. This is not Guggenheim dressing in his best. These boys, 22 and 25 years old, stayed at the quay until at least 2 a.m. This is absolutely incredible. They deserve all the love and praise that they have received over the last 112 years. I know I'm usually a broken record about like, well, it's not as dramatic as it sounds. Like that's kind of what I do, unfortunately. But this and the orchestra, like between those two, like there's nothing you can take away from them. Now let's rejoin Bride once more on the roof of the officers' quarters as the chaos continues. Do you know whether there was any lifeboats on the ship at that time?
There were no big lifeboats on the ship at that time. There was a collapsible boat on the top deck at the side of the forward funnel.
What was done with it?
It was pushed over onto the boat deck. There was not anyone in it. It was pushed over intentionally, and we were going to launch it properly.
Then what happened?
It was washed overboard before we had time to launch it.
And fell into the water?
Yes, sir.
Bottom side upward?
Yes, sir.
And how far were you from the water when you saw this boat fall?
I was in the boat.
You were under the boat?
Yes.
About how long?
It seemed like a lifetime to me, really.
How many people were on that boat?
It was estimated between 30 and 40.
Do you know any of them?
I heard afterwards that the senior operator was on board.
Mr. Phillips?
Mr. Phillips.
He did not survive, however.
He did not survive. I was the last man they invited on board.
Were there others struggling to get on?
Yes, sir.
How many?
Dozens.
Okay, so much to unpack here. Now, clearly in his testimony, Bride is describing an upside-down lifeboat, a lifeboat that listeners of Witness Titanic have been on board many times. Collapsible Lifeboat B, carrying our old friends from earlier episodes, Archibald Gracie and Charles Lightoller. And now we know Phillips was rumored to be on board as well. And if you had a hard time following the launching of Lifeboat B, it's confusing. I tried to splice together the answers in a chronological way. They don't really have a conversation about how this all happened, but in short, he's saying that he went on the roof of the officers' quarters to help free the lifeboat. They all pushed it down onto the boat deck so they could launch it from the boat deck like all the other boats, but a wave carried it off the boat deck, which we've heard of before. And somehow in the chaos of all of that, Bride found himself underneath the upturned lifeboat in the water, breathing in that little air pocket between the water and the seats of the boat. Terrifying. No, thank you. He somehow swims out. He gets away from the boat and he comes back to it later. It's kind of confusing. If you look at his various testimonies, he kind of tells a different story each time, which I fully understand. This must have been a crazy time to remember anything accurately. Bride also says something here in this section that really hit me. Sometimes testimony just like hits me right in the gut or the heart or something. He says that he was the last person that was allowed to board Lifeboat B. It brings to mind a story that we've heard on Witness Titanic before that you know I love. It's the story that once 30 or so men had scrambled onto the bottom of the upside-down lifeboat. They all agreed that no more should be allowed on board for fear that any more would sink the boat and then they'd all be in the water. And that once that decision was made, some man swam up to the boat and asked to be pulled aboard, but he was turned away. His response was apparently, "All right, boys, good luck, and God bless you." It's an absolutely fantastic, true story. Multiple people said this happened. It's a story I've always loved, but now here we are talking to Harold Bride, and he says he was the last one to make the cut before this man was turned away. Harold Bride was seconds away from being that man. So like every other survivor of the Titanic disaster, Bride was certainly quite lucky. So it seems that we now know the fate of Mr. Phillips. He ended up in Lifeboat B as well. He made the cut like Bride did, but he did not survive to see Carpathia. For some, the cold air was enough to still take your life. If you were soaked to the bone from being in the water and then you're standing in the cold air, you can still die of hypothermia. Sometimes the difference between surviving the Titanic tragedy or not depended on whether or not you were wearing a hat. We lose most of our body heat through the top of our head. So if you're ever really cold, make sure you get something, keeping the heat in your head. If you were leaving your cabin on Titanic, totally unaware what was to come, and you decide to leave your hat on the hook, that could be the difference for you, while someone else might have grabbed their hat on the way out and they reach Carpathia. So it literally could just be a decision like that. But it makes me think of John Phillips. Did he have his little wireless man's hat on? And during that scuffle with the fireman over the life jacket, did it fall off and get kicked over to the side? And so when they decided to leave the wireless room, he just left without his hat. And that's the difference for him. All these questions come to mind, and it just adds to the fascination of all of this. So now we know what happened to John Phillips. But what about the only other character from these episodes, Captain Smith? It is a hotly debated topic, as you may already know, because no one really knows what happened to Captain Smith. The 1997 film shows him in the wheelhouse in his final moments, which is very poetic, of course. But we will never know for sure. But if anybody can give us an accurate answer, it might be Harold Bride.
The last I saw of the captain, he went overboard from the bridge, sir.
What do you mean by overboard?
He jumped overboard from the bridge. He jumped overboard from the bridge when we were launching the collapsible lifeboat.
I should judge from what you have said that this is about 3 or 4 minutes before the boat sank?
Yes, it would be just about 5 minutes before the boat sank.
Do you know whether the captain had a life belt on?
He had not when I last saw him.
Did the bridge go underwater about the same time?
Yes, sir. The whole of the ship was practically underwater to the forward funnel, and when I saw her go down, the stern came out of the water, and she slid down fore and aft.
The captain at no time went over until the vessel sank.
No, sir.
He went with the vessel.
Practically speaking, yes, sir.
So this is kind of huge. Bride knew Captain Smith quite well, unlike Elizabeth Lyons, for example, in episode 26. He worked with Smith every day, so to speak, delivering messages to him, having conversations with him, unlike Ismay, who apparently saw him as much as any passenger would have. So Bride actually was around this person and had seen him just minutes before this final sighting. This could make Harold Bride's sighting of Captain Smith in Titanic's final moments the most credible. I should also mention that Bride covers Titanic's final moments in quite a lot of detail just now, but he does not mention the ship breaking in two. He estimates elsewhere that he was about 150 feet from Titanic when the ship went down, and no mention of the ship breaking in two. It just goes to show how easy it was to miss. And so Titanic is gone. Lifeboat B drifts in the open ocean upside down. The Carpathia is on its way thanks to two of the men on the underside of this lifeboat, one of which will live to see the ship that they were responsible for alerting. You may recall Archibald Gracie sharing a memory with us in his episodes, in his own words.
The Marconi man who was left on the raft said he thought that this was the Carpathia because he had conversed with the operator on the Carpathia. That was the nearest ship, he thought, to us at the time.
And just a reminder that this information was not a given. We all know that Carpathia is coming, but they do not. To them, they may be just starting the hardest part of this tragedy. We all take a deep breath when 712 people are safely in the lifeboats, but those 712 people are staring death in the face, and that death is called the open ocean, one of the most dangerous places you can find yourself. So what relief they must have felt when Bride tells them that not only is there a light on the horizon, but that light is there because it's coming for us.
I then experienced the most exciting 3 or 4 hours anyone could reasonably wish for, and was in due course with the rest of the survivors picked up by the Carpathia. After a short stay in the hospital of the Carpathia, I was asked to assist Mr. Cottam, the operator, who seemed fairly worn out with work. On arrival in New York, Mr. Marconi came on board with a reporter of the New York Times. Also, Mr. Sammis was present, and I received $500 for my story, which both Mr. Marconi and Mr. Sammis authorized me to tell. I am glad to say I can now walk around, the sprain in my left foot being much better, though my right foot remains numbed from the exposure and cold, but causes me no pain or inconvenience whatever.
And with that, Bride has concluded his account, an incredible tale from top to bottom. But he also mentioned the New York Times article, so I think it's time we finally take a look at it. So when Carpathia arrived in New York, there was a very strict policy of no press being let on board for obvious reasons, but press were allowed some passes to get closer to the pier where the survivors would be disembarking. But these passes didn't let you get terribly close. Yet, when Carpathia docked and most of Titanic survivors disembarked, a reporter from the New York Times named Isaac Russell just walks up the gangway and finds Bride clicking away in the wireless room. Now, how this all happened is a wild tale in itself. Maybe the subject of its own episode down the road, we'll see. But in essence, Russell was not assigned to the media circus that was going to be Carpathia's arrival in New York, and he was upset about this. He didn't want to miss the biggest story of the century. So he managed to get himself assigned some menial task distantly related to it that took him to the New York headquarters of the Marconi Wireless Company, and who should answer the door but Guglielmo Marconi himself. Marconi, hoping to speak with Harold Bride personally, thought a member of the press with a pass should be able to get him on the Carpathia. Otherwise, he's kind of out of luck. Now, Russell was not given a pass by his employers. I think the New York Times only was given 5 passes, and they certainly weren't going to give it to him. but Marconi could be their pass. So Russell says, sure, I've got a pass. I can get you on board. And the two of them, both of them thinking that the other one is the reason the police are letting them through the barricades, somehow they manage to board Carpathia. So this is how the famous Bride interview came to be. It was the scoop of all scoops. In the journalistic world of 1912, this was a big deal. I think Isaac Russell is like a bit of a rock star for doing this. Apparently, some paper in London framed the article to inspire their own journalists to like pursue the biggest stories and all that. So this was a pretty significant deal. And then to the general public, it was for many the first time that they heard what happened from a somewhat reputable source. Speaking of, we know without a doubt it was Bride who gave this interview. He says it was him. So that's all we really need. And it does generally align with everything that we just heard over these last two episodes. So why am I so skeptical? Why am I always so skeptical? I'm always ruining all these great stories for you that you've always believed to be true, and I keep sucking the drama out of Titanic. Why do I keep doing this? Well, as we discussed in the Charles Dahl episode, we may have a confirmed survivor account like we do here with Bride, but we must leave room for the Russells of the world. He's the one who takes this story home and writes the article, possibly from just memory of what Bride said. And generally, I'm a bit distrusting of 1912 newspapers. I mean, as Bride and Russell and Marconi are discussing this tragedy, there are already rumors in the papers about Bride, and he hasn't even touched grass yet. Here, just as an example, here is one last bit of Bride's U.S. testimony regarding a laughable rumor that he had heard.
I would like to say, sir, that there is a rumor being circulated that Mr. Cottam and I were taking the baseball scores when we were returning to New York. It does not appear in the record, but it is unfounded, and there is no truth to it at all.
If you would like to have that appear, we should be glad to put it in.
I should certainly like to have it in.
So Bride himself had to insist that this be added to the record. Clearly, this rumor had disturbed him, or he had been accused in public of it. He really wanted this on the record, that no, he and Mr. Cottam, two British wireless operators, were not interested in American baseball scores, and neither was anyone on board Carpathia. Though, as a little sports aside, if they were taking the baseball scores, there is one score in particular that I find very interesting. In the top of the ninth, thanks to two errors on the same play, George McBride of the Washington Nationals scored the only run in their game against the New York Highlanders at Hilltop Park in New York City. This game interests me because first pitch was at 4 p.m. on April 15th, 1912. Just hours after the city awoke to the news. The murmurs, the rumors, the excitement in the air in that park would have been unreal. And other bonus facts, just 5 days after that game, the Highlanders would play in the first game ever at Fenway Park against the Boston Red Sox, and at the end of the season would change their name to the New York Yankees. Finally, I found a way to fit my love of baseball into this podcast. Join me next time on Witness Baseball. So now that you have been politely reminded how untrustworthy the 1912 newspapers can be, let's look at some passages of this iconic article, famous passages that have been reprinted in Titanic books as fact. I'll just read them, and you can decide for yourself, does this sound like the same young man that we have gotten to know over these last two episodes?
The captain came back. "What are you sending?" he asked. "CQD," Phillips replied. The humor of the situation appealed to me. I cut in with a little remark that made us all laugh, including the captain. Send SOS, I said. It's the new call, and it may be your last chance to send it. Phillips, with a laugh, changed the signal to SOS.
So that is an often repeated Titanic story. It might be the most famous story to come from the wireless room. There's even a deleted scene of it in the 1997 film. Go look it up. Phillips did at some point change the call from CQD to SOS. So there is some validity to that. Though some people say that it was the first time SOS had ever been sent. Of course it was not. It's just another one. I hope as you're listening to this podcast, your sort of red flag, your radar for apocryphal stories that sound right, but if you look into it, there's no reason for us to believe these things. Titanic did not send the first SOS, but at some point he did change from CQD to SOS. And as a warning, my puppy has awoken and she's now making noises. So I've been really lucky that we got this far. So you will be hearing some clicking and I think right now she's chewing on something. So be warned. But my bigger gripe with the SOS story is this idea that Captain Smith was laughing at Bride's joke. 5 minutes after he heard from Thomas Andrews that the ship is doomed and it will be sitting on the bottom of the ocean floor in the next few hours, I doubt Smith is laughing at anything right now. I also, just as another thought, I always thought that Bride's joke, when I was little, I didn't understand everything. Bride's joke about this may be your last chance to send it. I always thought he was saying that in like a morbid way, like we're all about to die, so this may be your last chance to send it. It took me till later in life to realize what he's saying is this may be our only chance to be in a distressful situation. You're not every day does a ship sink, so this is our chance to send SOS. How cool is that? So it is a good joke, I suppose. I just don't think he actually made it. Peanut, stop it. No. Now let's hear Bride's final thoughts on John Phillips' heroics.
How poor Phillips worked through it, I don't know. He was a brave man. I learned to love him that night, and I suddenly felt for him a great reverence to see him standing there, sticking to his work while everybody else was raging about. I will never live to forget the work of Phillips in those last awful 15 minutes.
He's not wrong. Of course, that is true. It's just a bit flowery of a wording for a guy who makes a living speaking in shorthand. That one's okay because it is true. And even if he didn't say it, that is a really nice memorial to Phillips. So we're not too mad about that. I just doubt he said it. Now let's look at my favorite one of the list. It's not the most egregious, but it's my personal favorite. So listen here to what is apparently Bride's memory of what Captain Smith said when he released Bride and Phillips in those final moments. Keep in mind, in his testimony that you've already heard, Bride described Smith saying that they had better look out for themselves. That's it. And then in the UK testimony, Bride remembers him saying, clear out. That's it. In the New York Times article, this is what Bride remembers Smith saying.
Men, you have done your full duty. You can do no more. Abandon your cabin. Now it's every man for himself. You look out for yourselves. I release you. That's the way of it at this kind of a time. Every man for himself.
It's just a really long group of sentences that say the same thing over and over again. It's just screaming over dramatization of a moment that really happened. You look out for yourselves is the only part that Bride backs up. The other 100 words are pure fiction. Now, in this New York Times article, how does Bride describe that fireman stealing John Phillips's life jacket?
I knew that man from below decks had his own life belt and should have known where to get it. I suddenly felt a passion not to let that man die a decent sailor's death. I wish he might have stretched rope or walked a plank. I did my duty. I hope I finished him.
Now, does that sound like 22-year-old Harold Bride, who we've been talking to for these last 2 episodes? Based on his words? Sure. But these are not Harold Bride's actual words or memories. And keep in mind, the entire article is written from his perspective, as if he wrote it. But here is the biggest telltale sign that this is not Harold Bride speaking.
Phillips clung on, sending and sending. He clung on for about 10 minutes or maybe 15 minutes after the captain had released him. The water was then coming into our cabin.
So apparently, the water was coming into the wireless room when they abandoned it, according to the New York Times. Interesting, of course, that he doesn't mention this under oath in either of his testimonies on either side of the Atlantic or in his letter to Marconi. Even more interesting is that in this article and in his testimonies, he talks about helping with Lifeboat B. He talks about seeing Captain Smith jump into the water when the bridge was being submerged, and that the water ends up near the first funnel. The wireless room was between the first and second funnel. If water is coming into the wireless room, Lifeboat B and the bridge, and Captain Smith apparently, have already been submerged for quite some time. So if water's coming into the wireless room, the rest of his testimony is impossible. What is more likely is that Russell made it sound like they barely escaped the wireless room, when in reality, they left around the time that the water was reaching the bridge, which is still terribly dramatic, but just won't play as well in his writing. So I hate to constantly ruin the great stories that you love about Titanic by sucking out all the drama like a vampire, but I think these discussions are important and more interesting, by the way, but they're more important because you can just point to these facts in this article, pretty much provable exaggerations or just straight up lies, whatever these are. And for me, that makes the entire article untrustworthy. If I can find one lie in it, especially if I can find 7 lies in it, why should I believe any other word of it? Yet these are stories from this article that we treat as fact. They have permeated into our discussions about Titanic, like the SOS story and water coming in the cabin and the dramatic monologue from Captain Smith. This is why we focus on the inquiries on this podcast and not newspapers. What I am interested in and have always been interested in is what actually happened, not a story of what happened. If I want that, I'll go watch the movie, which I love, and I think there's a value in that. But I'm here, what we're here for is what actually happened, and we can find that, or we have a better chance at finding that in the inquiries. Still don't believe me? Still need one more push? Are you still holding on to this article and saying, no, the SOS story is real? These stories, like they're not, they can't be completely made up. Well, here is a quote from Isaac Russell himself about the writing of this article.
They say literature is truth, touched by emotion. I have written steadily for 20 years or more. If ever I wrote literature, that was the night.
I rest my case. He even admits that he was writing literature. He was writing a screenplay, not a newspaper article. It's also worth mentioning that as a result of a supposedly inaccurate article that he wrote in 1915, Russell was fired from the New York Times. Big thanks to Max, one of the researchers over at THG, for sending me this backstory behind the article and all the information about Russell. Fascinating stuff. Yeah, boy, we've reached critical mass. We've reached critical mass. Hold on, pause everything. And with that, the witness withdrew. And you were so patient this whole episode. So anybody watching on YouTube, sorry, podcast listeners. Here's that little puppy that I've been talking about. This is Peanut. She's been a very good girl this whole time. It's going to be ASMR at that point. She's been a very good girl this whole time. And she's just now getting restless. So I'm just going to have to hold her for the rest of this little outro here. So, what did you think of the testimony? Did you think the New York Times version is a little touched up, a lot touched up? Should we just throw it out altogether? This is so hard to do with a puppy biting my fingers. Or was Bride just being more reserved under oath, which is a reasonable thing for someone to do? We will never know for sure, but I'd love to see what the consensus is from everybody listening out there. So let me know in comments on YouTube, on Spotify. Send me an email, witnesstitanic@gmail.com. Let me know. Before we go, a huge thank you again to the Witness Titanic patrons for making these episodes possible. My highest tier of patrons receive bonus testimony from our witnesses, and this week I have an entire section of Bride's U.S. testimony that is absolutely fascinating. He was questioned quite a bit about the Frankfurt, the first ship that responded to their CQD. There's a whole saga that we did not have any time to get into in this episode about the Frankfurt, why it doesn't come to Titanic's aid. Carpathia comes, Olympic turns around, Baltic is too far. Why didn't the Frankfurt come? Well, it's kind of a funny story, but also very frustrating. There is a real chance that Frankfurt could have been more involved in this than she was. Ow. But that is something we will talk about when we have our bonus testimony for patrons only. So join the Patreon if you want more testimony. Big thanks, as always, to the Titanic Inquiry Project, to Ege Erdogan for the theme music. If you enjoyed this episode, and if you're enjoying this, please consider liking, loving, following, sharing, subscribing. Follow me on Instagram, follow me on TikTok. But most importantly, please be kind to each other, Titanic community. I'm your chairman, James Penca. This is Peanut. We will see you next time when we continue our inquiry into the loss of the RMS Titanic.